Apparently, it's been 8 months since I've done one of these videos where I go and visit a city in a day, and arguably it's been 7 months since I've done any videos at all. But that's life. Here's 6 hours in Bristol. Joining the Great Western Main Line at Didcot, we headed west towards Bristol, passing flat plains, having a brief look at the Cotswolds, passing the nearby city of Bath, and then arriving at Bristol Templemead Station at 11:15 to begin our 6 or so hours that it would take to go around, and finding that for some reason a vegan Magnum exists, and I don't see how you could fit meat into an ice cream in the first place, but it's all in good fun, I suppose. Eventually we found the bus that we needed to head to our first stop of the day in the nearby area of Tottersdown, where we saved a great welcome of an abandoned lot, graffiti, litter, a shopping trolley tied to a street lamp for some reason, usual good welcomes. But we weren't here to admire the view, we were here to see that street, which is extremely steep. Allegedly, it's the steepest street in the UK, and it's hard to show on camera how steep it is, but even then you can tell it's a pretty steep street. A nice early morning exercise to climb to the top of it. And having conquered the street, having a view over Bristol, finding that the neighbours are pretty generous here. They let you borrow screen wash and engine oil for some reason. But unfortunately we find that this is not the steepest street in the UK, it's the second steepest street in the UK. Which means we gotta go back down again, and around, and climb up the other side of this hill. Fortunately, on the way back, there was a cat to greet us, and probably wondering why the hell we were walking about. I was probably wondering why the hell I was walking up some incredibly steep street this early in the morning. But then we found it. Vale Street. Officially the steepest street in the UK. So steep, it has a stairs on it. Very much needed here, because that's pretty steep. That's really steep. But after that initial first few meters of steepness, though, it does begin to level off somewhat. So I was beginning to have some thoughts here. That this officially unofficial record is misplaced. Because if you were to take an average gradient of the whole of Vale Street and compare it to the nearby streets, I don't think it'll be that impressive. It's literally just that bottom piece. Like, the street next to it, with a claimed 1 in 4 gradient, visually looks a lot steeper on average. So, I don't know what's going on here. Yes, there's no arguing that the first few meters of Vale Street is pretty steep. It's as good as a wall, and you can see where the local sump guards have taken a hit from it, but I don't know, I'm not convinced. I think this record needs redefining to what counts as the steepest street in the UK, but anyway, enough of that. All down the hill, head back to the centre. After spending far too long disputing a record that doesn't even exist, we headed to the city centre, where we actually got dropped off in the wrong place. But we did end up in a nice place. We ended up at the Bristol City Centre landing, which was currently home to some sort of food market and cascading steps, and is one of the many sort of quays and inlets throughout Bristol Harbour that go across the city centre. And yeah, it turned out to be market day, so we headed down the quay side, past all the stalls selling bits and bobs and taps, but it was generally a nice, pleasant atmosphere, which I don't really usually get to experience on these trips, because I usually travel at bad times, but for once I choose a civilized day, a nice day, and the crowds were out in full force. Also found this a pub with an interesting warning for its glass windows, and we ended up crossing this interesting bridge to head to Queen Square. Queen Square is this large lawn square surrounded on all sides by terraced townhouses. It was one of the first proper planned residential areas of Bristol. Designed to make the city a bit more open, and immediately it attracted the wealthy, and historically one of the wealthiest residential areas in Bristol because of that. At its centre is a statue of William III, and along the bases something is inscribed, presumably this thing dedicated to the citizens of Bristol or something like that, even though it's actually quite hard to read. The square was also the site of the 1831 Bristol riots, which you can see why it is. Wide open spaces is ideal for a good riot. Leaving the square towards Spike Islands, we passed this pottery, which there's not really significant about it, it's just kind of cool to see it on display. And I find this spinning bridge having just timed it right for when the bridge will open, which is a process that takes several minutes for the bridge to open and close. Very squeaky while it does, and causes a bit of congestion on either side as people wait for the boats to pass through. And while waiting, we find one of the more rarer sights in the UK, a Corvette in life, like in the flesh, out and about doing things. Leaving the Corvette behind, we crossed over the bridge onto Spike Island, where we find the M-Shed, which is part of the Bristol Museum. And outside of the wall, a reminder of how Bristol became as prosperous as it is. Its wealth built on the exploitation of hundreds of thousands of innocent people. But anyway, on a more happier note, we went into M-Shed, which is part of the Bristol Museum, and is free to enter, and more or less tells the entire story of the city of Bristol. How it became an industrial power, the history of the harbour and its importance, and just many various, just the whole social history of the city. One thing I really liked was how along the walls they had essentially little sections dedicated to each area of the city to tell local history, which I find fascinating. I don't know everyone else seems to just ignore the walls. But yeah, just all the different aspects of the Bristol's history, including a very clever tram seat, which I don't know why we don't use anymore.
Top is wet. Dry side. And switch it over when that gets wet. Why did we stop me?
Well, the M-Shed is definitely worth a visit. It's not the biggest museum in the world, so we were quickly on our way again, just in time to see the steam train pass by. This train regularly runs along the harbour on the old harbour railways, and while we're by the harbour, maybe a quick history lesson on the harbour itself, which I think is actually quite interesting. So Bristol, on the west coast of England, but is several miles inland along the River Avon. But with its westerly position was traditionally the starting point for expeditions to go to the Americas. But the city had a problem as ships began to get bigger, in that the Avon was tidal, and that ships would bottom out and keel over on low tide. So, a floating harbour was built, which is essentially what we're walking along here, which is a harbour that has locks on either end to keep a constant water level, no matter what the tide is like on the Avon. And with that, it allowed Bristol to become a trade hub, with the triangular trade mentioned earlier, of sending manufactured goods to Africa, slaves over to the Americas, and then goods from the plantations back over to England. And yeah, the harbour is very literally the centre of this city. It's what it was all built on, and it's physically running right through the city centre, so much so that taxi boats like the one I'm on are actually pretty common. Even though this ride I'm on here is pretty short, it does save you about half an hour walking, so £1 well spent, I would say. Of course, eventually ships would outgrow the expanded harbour itself in the early 20th century, leading to the creation of Avonmouth at the mouth of the River Avon, just a few miles west of Bristol, which is still the main harbour for the area. Having made our little pleasant boat journey across the harbour from Spike Island, we then continued to head back towards the centre for a little bit, going through this very generic neighbourhood, which is in stark contrast to the Bristol we'd seen so far, which was sort of bustling and exciting. But it led on to Millennium Square, which is a modern square featuring bog hotels, solar panels on trees, and this big silver dome, which naturally you have to stare at and try and find your own reflection and be weirded out by it. Also, along the ground is an analemma, or however you're supposed to say it, which is a series of discs that track the position of the sun throughout the year. Actually, there's 52 for the 52 weeks in the year. And they also have several fountains, including this one, which, it's illegal to pass without poking it. And a topographical map of Britain and Ireland, which, I don't know, there's nothing significant about this at all, I just always like these things. Leaving Millennium Square, we then head along this little narrow lane, which brings us to the side of Bristol Cathedral, which dates from the 12th century, and is adjacent to College Green, which, as hinted by the name, was infested by college students out enjoying the sun. The offices of the Bristol City Council are also on the other side of this square, and that's that brown curved building right in front of us. Now, this other highlights how nice of a day it was. It was generally a really lovely day. I was going around, which unfortunately would be the last of this weather we would have for a little bit, but it was nice while it lasted. Leaving the square, we then head north towards Clifton, but first stopping by Brandon Hill, which is this large park on Brandon Hill, the centre of Bristol, which is frankly just quite lovely little park. Well, not really that little either. But in the centre is Cabot Tower, which is named after one of the early Bristolian explorers who left Bristol for America, and is just an open observation tower on the top of Brandon Hill. Very narrow stairs up to the top, very crowded at the top because there's essentially no control over how people get to the top or anything like that, but once you get there, probably the best views you're going to get of the city, better than the observatory that we'll go to later, and it's absolutely free, so there's absolutely no excuse not to climb to the top of this tower and have a look about at the city and the Avon Valley. Having got back down from the tower, we then headed off towards Clifton to see Bristol's most famous landmark, the Clifton Suspension Bridge. Often credited as Brunel's masterpiece, as it was based on Brunel's design, even though the design was so heavily revised after his death that really he probably shouldn't be credited that much at all for the design, but whatever. The bridge was opened in 1864 across the Avon Gorge, or 75 metres above the river below, and yeah, it's become the landmark of Bristol, often used in publicity and postcards and all sorts of things. It's quite an interesting history since then. It's the site of the first modern bungee jump. Concorde flew over it. Several people have tried to fly under it, not all of them successful. The bridge has also traditionally had a darker history, being well known for suicides. The first, which was actually a failure because the young lady who jumped off, her skirt acted like a parachute, so she actually survived the landing, all the way below into the mud. Since then, barriers have been put up along the bridge, and even today, even though it's not the main road across the River Avon, it's still pretty busy, and a lot of 50p tolls are collected, which are then used to maintain the... Having crossed the bridge and come back, we then head over to the nearby observatory, which offers a nice view over the bridge itself and the gorge, even if people don't really seem to care much for the safety signage. The observatory has been in this site for several hundred years, originally being a windmill, but that caught fire due to its own friction, and since then it's been used as an astronomical observatory, later then becoming one of the centres for the development of the camera and photography, and appropriately houses a camera obscura. A camera obscura is essentially a darkened room with a lens at the top that allows light to come in and be projected onto a table. Unfortunately, the room is too dark for me to actually film it, but the effect is really cool. It's like you're looking down at this table and you can see outside and a 360-degree view as you move the lens about. Really cool. And you can see how in the 19th century this would have blown people's minds. Not as impressive nowadays since modern cameras exist, but still. Having seen that, we then go down to the bottom of the observatory because, of course, the observatory links to a cave. A man-made cave built in the middle of the 19th century down to the side of the cliff in a very dark, narrow, short passageway, which I don't know how to get away with letting people down nowadays. The whole fun of this is just climbing down this little tunnel in the side of the cliff, and eventually appearing at the bottom in this little cavern with a balcony that allows you to look out onto the Avon Gorge. Not for those afraid of heights, as you stand out into grating halfway up the side of the cliff face, but yeah, the view is what it is. It's nice and all that, but the main fun is the climbing up and down through that little tunnel, which, is not for the claustrophobic, not even close to the claustrophobic. If you're claustrophobic and afraid of heights, this is about the worst thing you could do in Bristol, but it's really cool and definitely a unique thing to see. I then climbed back out of the giant's cave. I then sat down for a little bit to take a little rest, taking inspiration from the locals and many people who are doing the same, before getting the bus back to the city centre, where we passed by the Centupat, a memorial to the First and Second World Wars, which are fairly common in most British cities, and then turned down Corn Street, where the market was just about wrapping up, so if you hadn't bought your tat from earlier, there was still a second chance to go around, and then coming across the Corn Exchange, where, you guessed it, they once exchanged and traded corn here. It's not just interesting for that, but for the clock, because the clock has 3 hands, 2 red and 1 black. Now the red hands are normal standard time, but the black minute hand is 10 minutes behind, and that's because that hand is on Bristol time, which before standardized time, when Bristol had its own time, was 10 minutes behind London time. And when the changeover happened, they just kept this clock with Bristol time on it. Also in front of the Corn Exchange are these like little columns, which are called the nails, which is where the traders would exchange money on top of and do their deals. At this point we're passed by a guy who is completely devoid of fucks to give about anything. Around the corner we end up discovering this covered market sort of thing, where there's many like stalls and stands and little restaurants selling food, those little shops in this covered market, which I didn't know existed. This was a complete accident that I discovered this, but it's pretty neat and lovely. Like, I didn't buy anything, but it's just a lovely little thing to discover that I didn't even realise was there. Leaving the market, we head across to Castle Park, which was full of people enjoying the good evening. In the centre we can see St. Peter's Church, which is a remarkably good looking ruin. It is very much ruined, but it's well preserved. Outside of the church there is this colourful plaque to the Britishers who fought in the Spanish Civil War, 4 of which were from Bristol. About approximately 500 Britishers fought in the Spanish Civil War. Behind the church is where the Bristol Castle itself used to be, but it's now full of construction and people sunbathing. We can also see from here the shot tower, that grey tall tower in the middle, which is where lead shot used to be made by dropping molten lead droplets from the top of the tower, and it would solidify and form perfectly round little balls by the time it hit the bottom. With that, we had worked our way back to Bristol Temple Meads station, more or less just short of 6 hours since we arrived this morning. Unfortunately, they've put some sort of advertising thing in front of the plaques telling you about the Great Western Railway, but we'll get over that. We'll have to live with it. So that was Bristol in about 6 hours. It's one of those cities that you don't realise is as interesting as it is until you set out to go there and realise, why have I never been here before? So nice and interesting day. I have no idea when the next one of these will be, but I'll see you next time I decide to go out for a walk.